Okay, so slightly less pretty pictures in this, but hopefully some really interesting, useful insights. So I'm going to talk about some current computational challenges in volumeEM, and I'm specifically going to report back on the survey that we ran, which hopefully many of you were able to participate in. And we've used the survey to build the roadmap, which Martin and Matthew will present on next. So first up, survey respondent demographics. So we gave quite a lot of field options, which are on the left-hand side of the screen there. Not every single one of them was used. You can see that the vast majority of people who responded to this survey identify as being in cellular or tissue biology, with another subset in the image analysis / AI category. And then about a quarter of our participants were other things. The next thing was, what role do you hold? So the vast majority of our participants were facility staff, with another secondary component in the senior academic group. And then again, about a quarter mixture between other early career or mid-career product development in industry type roles. Okay, and then the last demographics question is, what world region do you reside or work in? So we had pretty good responses from Europe and North America, and then much less responses from the rest of the world, which is not surprising given where we are, and also that our channels still need to grow into other areas of the world. Okay, so that's the demographics, just to give you an idea of who responded. And then the way that we did this, just to give you some insight, is we asked two general questions about a lot of different steps that people tend to take in volumeEM. So the two questions were, do you feel you know what software to use for blank? Okay, and then what software do you use for blank? So we wanted to get a feel for how well people felt they understood what to use, and then also what they did use. So this is the example here for data transfer. So on the left-hand side, you can see that, most people did not feel that they knew what software to use for data transfer. So that's the red side of that graph. And then on the right-hand side, you can see all of the different things that people are actually using in order to do data transfer. And so obviously the biggest thing that people are using are their built-in file explorers and copy paste. So this is an area that we can potentially help as we start to think about how to modify what people are doing within the field. Okay, I did want to also just point out, you can see I put some boxes up, that out of all of the tools that people do use for this, Globus was the most used. You can see a lot of small words there, but Globus is starting to become a little bit more used within the field. So the next area that we looked at was image alignment. And so again, this is another example where people don't feel that they know, or sorry, where they do know what software to use. And that software is ImageJ or Fiji for the most part. And I did just want to highlight that if people gave details of like a plugin in ImageJ or Fiji, so for example, in this case, TrackEM, I put that under one bucket, which is ImageJ Fiji, but this one very much was dominated by TrackEM. Okay. For image stitching in 2D, it's very similar. So people knew what they were wanting to use, and that thing that they were wanting to use is ImageJ Fiji and specifically TrackEM. I think one of the take-homes from some of these early ones here is just how prevalent the use of ImageJ Fiji is still in this field. So I know that people are starting to use other things, like you'll see some more proprietary options up there from the various manufacturers. You see things like Microscopy Image Browser, and in later ones, you'll see Napari start to pop up as well. But the vast majority of respondents to this survey, and I think a representative of the field, are still using ImageJ Fiji for their workflows. Okay, and that follows through into registration of multiple modalities in both 2D and 3D, although once we start to get into 3D, this is where things start to change and we start to move a little bit away from ImageJ Fiji and more into things like Amira Aviso or Napari. You start to see Big Warp a bit more in this circumstance. You'll also start to notice bespoke. So if people came back with something on GitHub or something that they wrote as their response to this, I grouped that all into one category, which is bespoke. So So you'll start to see that category growing as well. And I think you can also start to see that we're starting to get to the tipping point of people not really knowing what software to use once they start to work in 3D. Okay, so manual segmentation was a really interesting one because people felt strongly that they knew what software to use, but we still had a really broad range of software tools that are used across the field. And then when we moved into machine learning and AI segmentation, it's pretty similar and like even broader. So this is, in my experience, an example of where, you know, we're broadening across the field. There are lots of options and we're still developing in this area. So there are new options coming up, you know, each year. And it hasn't yet kind of tailored down into something that is consistently used by most people in the field yet. So we're still broadening in the field of machine learning AI segmentation. Okay, and then for quantification of annotations and segmentations, we're into a Mira Aviso land, although we still see some things like Comet Dragonfly coming back up and that bespoke option coming back up. Here, when we start thinking about pipelining the entire process or parts of the process, you see all of the standard tools. So Mira, Image APG, Microscopy Image Browser, and Dragonfly all come up as options for pipelining. But all of the comments that people were making indicated that they stayed in that ecosystem. They weren't switching from one ecosystem to the next for their pipelining tasks, which makes sense because a lot of times that's where a lot of the friction is. And you'll also start to see things like Python Dask or Python or Bespoke. So MATLAB, these are things where people are doing their own coding essentially to pipeline. Okay, now we're back to moving data between software. Like I said, this is where a lot of that friction lies. And you can see that there's a huge amount that essentially is in that bespoke area, which isn't surprising. But that obviously limits the people who have access to it because it's bespoke for their site and not broad usually. And that you can see we revert back to File Explorer when we're talking about moving data between systems, so now larger movements. Okay, and then the last thing we asked about in this set of questions was addressing metadata mismatches, because I'm sure all of us are aware that as you're collecting data over, you know, months and years, sometimes there can be some errors that creep into the metadata. And the vast majority of people here are using manual fixes, using something like Python or a text editor. So, and they don't really know what they should be using because there doesn't really exist something that allows you to do this more broadly. Okay, cool. So that's all summarized on the left-hand side of the slide. I know it's a bit busy, so know what software to use, yes, no on the left. We also asked the exact same question across all of these different categories of activities. But the question now is, what is the most difficult step? So that's in the middle there. And then we also asked, what is the most tedious step on the right-hand side? So just to give you some context there. And there are a couple that I want to highlight. I'm happy to share all of this afterwards. We'll write it up, so don't feel like you have to like scribble things down. But the two that I wanted to highlight are specifically image stitching in 3D, where people felt like they didn't really know what to use. And it was one of the most difficult steps and most tedious steps. So this seemed like a good place for us to be focusing on as like a CCP-volumeEM in order to move the field forward here. And then the other area, as I kind of already highlighted, is the machine learning or AI segmentation, where people did feel like they knew what software to use, but it was still one of the most difficult and tedious steps, which isn't too surprising. Okay, so we also asked some more generic questions. Specifically, we said things like, what pieces of software do you have issues installing and why? So this was fun. It's a mixture question, so you'll see some are software and some are why. But the things that came through the most were Napari. So you see Napari as a whole, as well as Napari and Empanada, and then Napari Microstam. There's also iMod is on here a couple of times, depending on whether or not you're on a Windows or whatnot. So I think those are kind of the two standout softwares that were highlighted as the most difficult to work with. And then there are a lot of different reasons why, but I think one of the biggest ones, if you kind of group things together, is just developers not having the resources to necessarily test on all different operating systems, and then it becoming difficult for a user who's on a different operating system to engage with that piece of software. Okay, so we also asked some questions about typical data. So thinking about a single data set, what's the typical data size? About half of respondents were in the 1 to 100 gigabyte range, with another third under a terabyte. And then when we asked how many data sets do you collect in a single session, most people are collecting between 1 and 5, although there are long tails on that. And the file formats that are most often used are TIFF stack and MRC. And then there's a little bit there in the Amira Aviso proprietary side of things, as well as a whole range. We did put ZAR, OME ZAR, and OME's TIFF in there, and while we're starting to see more use of those file formats, they are definitely not fully embraced by the community yet. So there's a bit of work to do there. We also asked a question about environmental impact. So how concerned are you about the environmental impact of processing your data? And about half of respondents said that it may influence decisions if they knew more. So that kind of indicates a desire to know a bit more about this topic. And then the last question that I'm going to go through today is comfort levels. So what is your level of comfort with? And then we listed out a couple of things. And so I just want to highlight again, OME ZAR is at the bottom there. And you can see that while people are used to the idea of it, their comfort level is still quite low with OME ZAR. So that's kind of an area that we need to maybe think a little bit more about. And then, as Lucy indicated, right, the comfort level of running Jupyter notebooks is still a little bit lower, and especially engaging with or writing Jupyter notebooks is even lower than that. One thing I found quite interesting, given all of the complaints earlier on and some of the difficulties that were highlighted, is that people do feel that they are very comfortable with installing software. So that's kind of an interesting dichotomy within the context of the data that I don't have an explanation for necessarily. Okay, so I will briefly wrap up. So first, thank you to everyone who participated in the survey. I think some of you are probably in the room. We really appreciate it. We can't figure out what to do in order to address the community needs unless we have feedback from the community. So thank you. As I said, I'm happy to chat more and share these results. They will be written up, and we will share them on the mailing lists and on volumeem.org in the future. And with that, I think I can take some questions.